Highbridge, a division of Recorded Books, presents Revolution and Terror by Graeme Gill. Read by Julian. Preface. My interest in revolution and terror goes back many years, to my undergraduate student days at Monash University. At the time, I was particularly piqued by the observation that revolutions conducted in the name of high ideals had so often not only fallen well short of realizing those ideals, but had actually produced outcomes that had involved terrible suffering on the part of the general populace. But also curious was the fact that the new revolutionary elite was not immune from the terror that was a major cause of popular suffering. Reflected in the epigram, "The revolution, like Saturn, devours its children," those who conducted the revolution often found themselves overwhelmed by revolutionary violence. Examining these outcomes of revolution, a focus on the origins of state terror in revolutionary regimes seemed an obvious course of study. Surprisingly, there has been little comparative analysis of the use of terror by revolutionary regimes, especially compared with the study of the way terror has been used in an attempt to overthrow regimes. This book seeks to fill this relative gap by explaining how the use of terror by regimes is related to the revolutions that brought those regimes about. It asks whether terror is an intrinsic, necessary part of revolution, as many claim, or a purely conjunctural development. The emphasis in the book is strongly on the relationship between revolution and terror, not on describing the individual actions that constitute that terror. For those interested in this, many of the studies of individual cases of terror will provide such, often graphic, detail. 1. Revolution and the question of terror. The revolution, like Saturn, devours its children. Attributed to the moderate French revolutionary P.V. Vergniaud in 1793, just before his execution by the Jacobins, this quotation refers to the way in which the Jacobins turned the terror against some of their fellow revolutionaries. The same claim has been made of those other commonly acknowledged great revolutions, the Russian of 1917 and the Chinese of 1949. In both cases, about a decade and a half after the revolutionary seizure of power, terror was unleashed by one section of the revolutionary elite on another. The implication of the claim is that there is something about revolution as a phenomenon that causes the new rulers to turn on themselves. However, this claim is contentious. Revolution is one of those phenomena that provoke heightened passion and significant polarization. For many, it is seen as an uplifting experience, a means for the oppressed to throw off their shackles and achieve the freedom that has long been denied them. For others, it is seen as a catastrophe, perhaps conducted in the quest to achieve high ideals, but in the result leading to widespread hardship, dictatorship, and terror. For the latter, even when there were gains made, for example in terms of greater equality, the costs were excessive. It is this latter view that provides the focus of this book, in particular the argument that terror is an inevitable result of revolution. This argument has been particularly associated with the way in which, following the seizure of power, the revolutionary elite split, with part of it purging another part. Robespierre's attack on his enemies within the French revolutionary elite in 1794, Stalin's purges in the Soviet Union in 1936 to 1938, and Mao's Cultural Revolution in the late 1960s have all been seen as evidence of this. But most scholars have generally seen a much broader association between revolution and terror than simply the latter's effects on the revolutionary elite. Terror has widely been seen as being intrinsic to revolution. In the words of an historian of the French Revolution, "From the very beginning, from the summer of 1789, violence was the motor of the revolution." For one theorist of revolution, the use of terror against opponents was the norm in revolutionary states, while two students of authoritarian rule declared, "As revolution spread, the corpses continued to accumulate." It is the relationship between revolution and terror that this book seeks to understand. The previous cited views reflect two different conceptions of revolution: revolution as liberation, a normative project, and revolution as social upheaval and destruction, a violent process. The resultant, highly contested nature of revolution as a concept has spawned a very large literature, but one which, unsurprisingly, is characterized by significant differences of opinion and evaluation. There have been three main foci of this literature. What is revolution? Why does revolution come about? And how does revolution unfold, sometimes seen in terms of the results of revolution? The defining of revolution has proved to be more contentious than defining many other terms in comparative and international politics. Main differences have turned on such issues as whether revolution must be rapid and short, or whether it can be prolonged, whether violence is an essential part, and whether social class must be a factor. Some adopt a restricted view of what constitutes revolution. For example, Martin Mallier sees it as a purely European phenomenon that spread to other parts of the globe via European influence, while Jack Goldstone limits revolution to those upheavals pursuing a vision of social justice, while others have a more expansive view. Most have sought to define revolution by identifying particular features or characteristics said to be present in all revolutions, an approach criticized by George Lawson, who argued that revolutions had neither ascribed properties nor fixed attributes, but were sequences of events that attain their significance as they are threaded together in and through time. Lawson, in line with a number of other scholars in the 21st century, is attempting to move beyond seeing revolution as what he calls a static entity, instead referring to it as an emergent process. This view focuses on the process of revolution rather than its outcome, on political activity, seen in terms of popular mobilization, rather than the results of political activity. But it is difficult to see how this focus on process as the means of defining revolution is useful in the absence of agreement about what we are looking for to denote a revolution, which assumes some sort of agreement about properties or attributes. How do we know an emergent process is a revolution if we do not have an understanding of what is necessary for something to constitute a revolution? Furthermore, at base, the term revolution implies substantial change. Without the notion of change, revolution is meaningless. Accordingly, it does not seem very sensible to see revolution in terms of political action without seeing the results of that action. But this means that we need another term to refer to popular mobilization that may lead to a revolutionary outcome. Charles Tilly has suggested one: revolutionary situation. For Tilly, a revolutionary situation existed when two or more blocks make effective, incompatible claims to control the state or to be the state, i.e. multiple claims to sovereignty, and revolutionary outcomes occurred with transfer of state power from those who held it before the start of multiple sovereignty to a new ruling coalition. A revolutionary situation is therefore when popular mobilization threatens to bring about regime change, with revolution occurring when that change is achieved. A revolutionary situation with a revolutionary movement could exist, as in the Arab Spring, but if there was no substantial change politically, socially or economically, there was no revolution. This distinction between revolutionary situation and revolution has a twofold advantage. It avoids the logical difficulties involved in talking about failed revolution, and it enables the definition of revolution to retain a reasonably tight focus, while also enabling us to appreciate the revolutionary possibilities evident in the pre-seizure of power period. One issue that has bedeviled definitions of revolution has been the political-social distinction. The heart of the issue is the dimension of change that would be expected of a revolution, but this has generally been reflected in the argument about class referred to briefly before. The argument that revolution must involve the replacement of one ruling class by a hitherto subordinate class stems principally from Marx and is at the heart of most discussions of social revolution. A social revolution is when one class replaces another. This not only involves the displacement of the ruling personnel of the state, but the upward mobility of large numbers of people from the hitherto lower class and the reworking of the structures of economic and status-based power in the society. It was this combination of substantial change in the political sphere, replacement of ruling personnel and the reworking of political power and institutions, with social transformation that was said to be the hallmark of the Great Revolutions. The distinction between political and social also meant that some analysts now distinguished between political revolutions, which simply involved the transformation of political power and those who wielded it, but no major upheaval in the social structure, from those where both political and social transformation occurred. There is also an economic dimension that could be relevant. Economic revolution would involve the transformation of the economic structure and processes whereby the society operated. It may accompany the widespread social change that constitutes social revolution, but it could also occur without major social change. Not everybody accepts the political, social, and perhaps economic distinction. One is Steve Pincus, who argues that a revolution must involve transformation of the socio-economic orientation and political structures of a society. If any of these are missing, it is not a revolution. In contrast, Tilley argues that broad social change is not a necessary part of revolution, which he defines as a forcible transfer of power over a state in the course of which at least two distinct blocks of contenders make incompatible claims to control the state, and some significant portion of the population, subject to the state's jurisdiction, acquiesces in the claims of each bloc. Furthermore, he declares that in revolution no fundamental alteration of social structure need occur. However, if we think of these three dimensions, political, social, and economic, as analytically distinct, even though in practice they are closely linked, and we accept that revolution must involve political change, meaning the overthrow of the leaders of the state and their replacement by new people, we can distinguish between different types of changes of regime. Full revolutions, where there was political, social, and economic transformation, such as the Russian and Chinese revolutions; revolutions where there was political and social change, but more limited real economic change, such as the French Revolution of 1789; revolutions where there was political change and economic change, but little social change, such as the so-called Velvet or negotiated revolutions of 1989, and those cases where there was only political change, but neither of the other sorts of change, such as most military coups, and the reversal of such coups as in Portugal in 1974 and Spain 1975. These distinctions, along with that between revolutionary situation and revolution, also enable analysts to distinguish revolutions from such other phenomena as peasant revolts, grain riots, strikes, reform movements, coups d'etat, and civil wars. Although it is important to recognize that all of these could be part of a particular revolution, and therefore they are not opposites to revolution. The emphasis on social transformation has another aspect, that of mass mobilization. One view holds that popular mobilization and involvement in the political struggle is the hallmark of revolution. The popular image of revolution is the storming of the Bastille in Paris in 1789, or the capture of the Winter Palace in Petrograd in 1917, and this undoubtedly captures one element of the scholarly notion of revolution. But to see such mobilization strictly in terms of classes is unnecessarily restrictive. Popular mobilization does usually have a class dimension. In many cases, it is undertaken by lower classes in opposition to upper or ruling classes. But such mobilization is in many instances cross-class, involving de facto class alliances between, for example, in the Russian case, urban workers and rural peasants. Or mobilization may be geographically constrained, so that while the lower classes in Paris may have mobilized, their equivalents in other cities remained more passive, meaning nationally the class was divided within itself. Or it could be ethnically based. It would be better to conceive of such mobilization in broader terms, of the mass populace rather than necessarily a particular class. This does not assume that all of the people are mobilized, or that they are active all of the time, but it does assume that revolution must involve a degree of popular mobilization. Otherwise, political change is a coup. However, what about when a coup mounted without widespread popular support leads to a regime that then introduces wide-ranging social, and possibly economic, changes that would, in their dimensions and nature, constitute a social economic revolution? This was the situation in, for example, Pinochet's Chile, where the military regime instituted neoliberal reforms in the economy that transformed the way that economy worked. Such a development has sometimes been referred to as a revolution from above. What is crucial here is the combination of transformation in the political sphere, a new regime comes to power, and transformation in the social-economic. Without that political change, the later economic change, if it did occur, would not constitute a revolution in the classical sense, even though those changes might be revolutionary in their impact. This also confirms that whether a change is actually judged to be a revolution or not may only be able to be made some time after the event. So how to define revolution? Lawson says that most agree that revolutions are rapid transformations, usually involving mass, violent action from below. For Goldstone, it is the forcible overthrow of a government through mass mobilization, whether military or civilian or both, in the name of social justice to create new political institutions. In Pincus' view, revolutions must involve both a transformation of the socio-economic orientation and of the political structures. That transformation must take place through a popular movement, and the transformation must involve a self-consciousness that a new era has begun. Elements of these three definitions may usefully be put together. Revolution involves the transformation of political rule and social and/or economic structures. Mass mobilization is a central force, at least at times in the process, and it involves a sense of a new beginning through the realization of principles which are said to be at its heart. This conception excludes Lawson's insistence on rapid transformation, because who is to say what is rapid? Both the English and Chinese revolutions could be said to have stretched over around 40 years, 1640 to 1688 and 1911 to 1949. Goldstone's insistence on social justice means that only progressive revolutions would be counted, while Pincus' insistence that transformation must occur through a popular movement seems to underplay the central role that elites play in most revolutions. This definition also does not specify violence as an essential element of revolution, although it may be implicit in many instances in the mass mobilization that is seen as essential. Turning to the second focus of the literature, why does revolution come about? There have been four basic schools of thought. These schools actually overlap, in the sense that some authors can fit into more than one, and this means that although the schools will be presented here in terms that emphasize their differences, in fact the differences will appear exaggerated. The basic outline that will be presented follows Lawson, but with some adjustments, and the individual writers cited are illustrative rather than being comprehensive. The first school of thought may be called the natural life cycle interpretation and is primarily historical in approach. The most important writer who has used this approach is Crane Brinton, but it is also evident in the work of, inter alia, George Petty and Bailey Stone. Brinton's work set a framework for the analysis of revolutions involving sequences that has endured, as shown by its continuation and elaboration in Bailey's work more than 75 years later. What is characteristic of this is the emphasis upon political change, upon the overthrow of the state and its replacement by a new political structure staffed by new people. Following de Tocqueville's maxim that the most dangerous time for a regime is when it begins to reform itself, these writers emphasize the way in which the ancien regime is in decline and seeks to introduce reforms in order to survive. They also acknowledge the emergence of an opposition group which challenges the rulers and, at least in part because of the weakness of the state, successfully displaces them. It is this weakness of the state, beset by crises, and then challenged by an opposition that is the crux of the explanation of why revolutions occur. A variation of this view is offered by an historian of the English Revolution of 1688, Steve Pincus, who argues that revolution does not occur when the state is weak, but when it has embarked on ambitious state modernization programs. This is similar to de Tocqueville's argument. More recently, Michael David Fox has argued that a life cycle analysis should be more expansive in the time period covered and more sensitive to the interaction of structural, conjunctural, and cultural factors. Critical of aspects of the Brinton-Stone approach, he argues for an appreciation of greater complexity and longer time horizons in our understanding of revolution. The second school of thought sought to place the revolutionaries at the center of the explanation. There were essentially three ways in which this was done. First, reflecting the emergence of social science and attempts to give it a scientific methodology, was the linking of revolution with modernization. In the 1960s and 1970s, there was a significant focus on modernization, which was seen as the process whereby underdeveloped or non-industrial societies underwent change designed to make them like the advanced industrial liberal democracies of the time. This was clearly a highly ideological view of what was happening in much of the non-European part of the globe. Theorists of revolution assumed that with modernization and the consequent massive structural changes experienced by a society, public expectations about increased opportunities, especially economic, rose, but these were often unrealized. Such unrealized expectations, it was argued, led people into rebellious or revolutionary activity. James Davies and Ted Robert Gurr were the principal writers in what has sometimes been called the socio-psychological explanation. However, this sort of voluntarist approach failed to show how the actions of dissatisfied individuals related to the broader historical and structural context of revolution, or how it brought revolution about. Given that all societies had individuals whose expectations were unrealized, this approach was unable to explain why revolution occurred in some societies experiencing modernization and not in others. Other theorists have argued that there is actually no direct relationship between the pace of structural change of the sort assumed in modernization and revolution. The second means whereby revolutionaries were put at the center of the analysis is biographical, and may be seen in the work of people like Dmitry Volgogorov and Jérôme Chen. The chief intent of these sorts of works was not explanation of the revolutionary process, but telling the story of the revolutionary leader's life. But in doing so, they did nevertheless contain explanations of the origins and course of the respective revolutions. But because they were concentrated upon one particular revolution, in these cases the Russian and Chinese, there was no generalization to revolutions as a phenomenon or any successful attempt at theorization. The third way of emphasizing the role of revolutionaries is that of so-called scripting revolution. This approach focuses on the way in which revolutionary scripts of earlier revolutions may shape the course of later ones. The key is that revolutionaries are aware of earlier revolutions and how they have unfolded, and may model their behavior, either positively or negatively, on how they believe their counterparts in earlier revolutions behaved. The idea of a script being followed, or not, by revolutionaries links different revolutions across time and space, and accepts that revolutionaries may learn from what preceded them. This idea of conscious action is also consistent with the emphasis on the ideology or values of the revolutionaries in the work of Martin Mallier. The third school was a reaction against the essentially voluntarist nature of the second school. This was the structural school, and it may be seen in the work of Theodore Skocpol, and in his earlier work, Jack Goldstone, although their most important progenitors were Barrington Moore and Karl Marx. For Skocpol, it was the structural location of the state between other states, internationally, and domestic political forces that was crucial in shaping the course of domestic events when international tension and conflict erupted. Goldstone argued that demographic changes reshaped the social order, destabilizing established structures, and thereby creating a crisis to which elites had to respond. Moore's focus was on the way in which peasants and nobles responded to the commercialization or lack of commercialization of agriculture and the implications that had for the Ancien Regime. And Marx's whole theory was based on the notion of class and how this was related to shifts in the underlying mode of production. Apart from the emphasis on the central role of macro-level structural factors in explaining revolutions, a major contribution made by some members of this group was to insert international factors into the process in a decisive way. While this had been present in some of the work of the first school, it had not been given the primacy that it gained under some of the structuralists. A different type of structural argument was advanced by so-called functionalists, or structural functionalists. This is exemplified by the work of Chalmers Johnson. Johnson's theory is cast in highly abstract terms, but what it amounts to is an argument that when there develops a significant discrepancy between social values and the environment, and the elite is unwilling or unable to engineer the changes to bring these back into harmony, revolution is likely to occur. The problem with Johnson's view is that the level of abstraction and associated vagueness and ambiguity makes it virtually impossible to apply the theory in a way that would explain revolution. Despite a rich and stimulating literature, structural explanations generally were unable to explain both why revolutions could break out when structural conditions did not seem to be present, or why they did not occur when those conditions were in evidence, without introducing such voluntarist elements as human actors, ideology, and contingency into the explanation. The fourth school seeks to take a multi-causal approach, with the role of contingency important, and is reflected in the work of John Foran, Jack Goldstone in his later work, and George Lawson. The previous cited paper by David Fox on revolutionary life cycles can also be seen to fit into this school. Revolutions were seen as, in Goldstone's words, complex emergent processes. They stemmed from the shift of societies from a position of stability to one of instability, where many aspects of the society have become frayed. For example, according to Foran, as summarized by Lawson, Third World revolutions emerged from the intersection of 5 sequential conditions: dependent state development, which exacerbated social tensions; repressive, exclusionary, personalistic regimes, which polarized opposition; political cultures of resistance, which legitimized revolutionary opposition; an economic downturn, which acted as the final straw in radicalizing opposition; and a world systemic opening, which acted as a let-up of external constraints. Central to this is recognition of influences stemming from outside the state, but in Lawson's view, this should not be restricted only to other state actors. In this view, state stability is always precarious, and when it is thrown into question by a multitude of challenges, the door is opened to revolution. Lawson argued that a revolutionary situation was produced by 3 critical configurations: changes in intersocial relations, the vulnerability of regimes, especially those based on personalist rule, and a systemic crisis rooted in the conjuncture of political, relative economic, and symbolic crises. When such a revolutionary situation exists, its outcome will depend upon the ability of the state elite to maintain its own unity, plus the loyalty of the coercive apparatus of the state, and the capacity of the opposition to create a cohesive, revolutionary movement that can mobilize and unite diverse coalitions. The combination of structural and voluntarist elements in this sort of approach holds the promise of a more rounded and robust explanation of revolution than we have had until now, but we are still awaiting the scholarship that would demonstrate this. There has been some debate about whether the fourth school has been superseded by a fifth one, reflecting what are seen to be very different revolutions occurring mainly around the end of the Cold War, compared to those preceding that development. The chief differences identified are that while there have been many instances of substantial mass mobilization, there has been little actual social transformation. Post-Cold War revolutions have been peaceful, negotiated, velvet, or unarmed, and the international dimension has been much more important both in terms of waves of revolution and of the international legitimation of revolutionary situations and their outcomes. However, much of this literature focuses on the process of revolution, what we have termed the revolutionary situation, and defines success solely in terms of the removal of the existing regime or ruler. This means that it includes discussions of revolutions when there was no substantial change, as in the Arab Spring, and cases of political change that were either linked with significant economic but no social change, such as the negotiated revolutions of 1989 in the former Eastern Europe, or with no change outside the political, like the colour revolutions. Not only are so-called failed revolutions included in the field examined, but, in the view of Colin Beck, so too could be such things as electoral and pacted transitions and non-violent mass protest. This seems to mean that this approach to revolution could encapsulate all forms of regime change, except perhaps the coup d'etat, where the masses are rarely involved, a development that seems to rob revolution of its analytical sharpness and much of its utility. Is it really a revolution if the only change is that of the personnel at the top of the state? Turning to the third theme of the literature, how does revolution unfold? The answer which set the parameters for debate for many decades stemmed from Brinton's work. Brinton used the metaphor of a fever and a healthy body as a way of discussing revolution, but few have followed this lead. More importantly, he argued that revolution...
Sample complete. Ready to continue?